All right, I'm on today with Karlyn Borosenko. How you doing today?
I'm doing well. Thank you for having me.
So she is a psychologist and independent journalist. We tried this not too long ago and had some technical issues. So I'm glad to get you back on because I think we have a lot of stuff to get into here. So just from a 30,000 foot perspective, real quick, just sort of give everybody a rundown on some of the investigative work that you've done in the field of communism and socialism.
Yeah, so I accidentally became an independent, investigative, and undercover journalist. I never intended to do this. It started off just years ago where I was covering crazy things that were happening on the left. I broke the story about the city of Seattle doing segregated training with its employees. That was actually the story that launched Christopher Rufo into this space because he was the only journalist who followed up on that. So that was pretty great. I broke the story about the that led to the first ever lawsuit for critical race theory in schools on a federal level. That was with Gabrielle Clark back in 2021. I broke the Coke Be Less White story that just was like massively viral. People still remember that today, where Coca-Cola was having its employees do trainings that literally told them to try to be less white. I broke a story about the public schools in Burlington, Vermont, grooming middle school children live on the internet to teach them. Basically, what was happening is the guidance counselors were using these 12-year-old middle school kids as pawns to come out as trans on the internet to teach other people how to come out as trans and promote that in the community. And so I broke the state of Michigan was doing the Department of Education in Michigan was doing training with teachers all over the state about how to groom children. Literally, I got access to a video archive of that. And then once I started doing all this digital stuff, so I was doing this for about 3 years, and then I said, well, it's time to go into the wild. It's time to actually go into the real world and interact with the far left in real life. And so I started actually going undercover at their events. I went to a socialist reproductive justice conference at Hampshire College last April. That was it was mind blowing in terms of, I had been watching socialists and far leftists on the internet for years. And it felt like I was going into my favorite TV show, except the TV show was real life. And so they were saying all sorts of crazy things there. And that was interesting too, because they were talking about reproductive justice, but they were also very focused on transitioning kids, and that sort of stuff. And so those two issues go hand in hand. One of the biggest things I did was I went undercover at this conference called the Socialism 2023 conference. It's literally called the Socialism Conference, and it's put on by the largest socialist book publisher in the United States. I got on audio recording Emily Drabinski, who is the head of the American Library Association, saying that libraries need to be sites of Marxist organizing. I got a teacher activist named Jesse Hagopian talking about doing fugitive pedagogy to sneak banned ideas into the curriculum in Florida and how he's working with teachers doing that. And most recently, literally just this weekend, I went undercover at a conference called the Transforming Gender Conference that was hosted and funded by the University of Colorado at Boulder. So this is a taxpayer-funded conference in which, among other things, I learned that multiple personality disorder is now considered a gender identity. So I cover the craziest dystopian things you will find on the internet, and it's real life.
That's absolutely crazy. So I kind of want to start here. Which is sort of taking a look at gauging the severity of this problem. You've obviously seen quite a bit and talked to a lot of people and come across a lot of material. For the average everyday American right now, people are struggling with surges in crime. We have upward inflationary pressures, which have led to higher interest rates, which are spiking mortgage rates and payments. Illegal migration to the United States is a huge problem in a lot of cities. So among the top issues that Americans are facing right now, where would you rank the issue of the threat of communism and socialism?
What I think people need to hear and understand is that every crazy thing happening in the United States right now can be traced back to the radical revolutionary socialists and communists that I cover. And so this is not theoretical. If we're talking about surges in crime, like defunding the police, decriminalizing theft, things like that, that is all the far left socialist agenda. This is something they believe that police officers are the managers of private property, which is something they want to abolish. And so one of actually their biggest issues is prison abolition. It's the abolition of the prison industrial complex. And so there are activists all over the country that are pushing all these crazy ideas. You look at a place like Chicago, which has, Illinois in general, but really pronounced in Chicago, has basically decriminalized everything. because it's being run by radical revolutionary socialists. And so you look at the immigration issue. Well, radical revolutionary socialists don't believe borders should exist. They believe that borders are an element of capitalism, and they're trying to get rid of all of them. And they're very pro all the immigrants coming in because it's going to completely destabilize the system and allow them another opportunity to push their agenda in this country. And the thing that's honestly the most alarming for me, Adrian, is the attack on parental rights that's happening in the country right now. The attacks on the nuclear family. People think, there's actually some viral stuff going on X right now where people don't understand why marriage and the nuclear family is considered to be a white supremacist concept. It all goes back to the same people. They do not believe that parental rights should exist. They believe that parental rights are a form of private property and must therefore be abolished. And so all the attacks on parental rights and the family we're seeing now comes from the same place. And so I know that this is an abstract concept for people to understand, but what I try to do in my work is to draw the lines to say, you think these are crazy people with pink hair that are mentally ill, and some of them definitely are, but every single crazy thing that's impacting your life is coming from these people. They are the source of the problem. And if we don't understand how the source works and how their strategies work, we can't defeat them.
And it sounds like, sort of on a broader scale, you're suggesting that the attacks on whiteness that we're seeing across the United States that people often complain about on social media are actually part of this communist movement.
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, this is a confusing issue for a lot of people. And I understand why it's confusing, because they think it has to do with skin color, like people looking like me. But that's not what whiteness means. Under the far left ideology, whiteness is actually a reference to capitalism. It's a reference to private property ownership. And I'll give you the brief overview of how this works. And I'm about to explain something that the left believes. I'm not suggesting I believe this. I'm explaining their philosophy as simply as I possibly can. They believe that capitalism, which is defined as private property ownership, created slavery in the United States because slavery is the ownership of people as private property. Slavery created something called systemic racism or institutional racism, which is a reference to the systems or the institutions that uphold racism in this country. And they very literally believe that we cannot fix racism until we abolish the system that holds it up. That system is capitalism. It's private property ownership. And so every time people are confused about why is this being called white supremacist? Why is that being called white supremacist? It has nothing to do with skin color. Well, you're right. It has nothing to do with skin color. It has to do with the economic system that they perceive to be upholding the idea of racism.
And you see these ideologies being so pervasive throughout the entire country. I think I saw a video that you shared last week or the week before of this group called Revolutionary Communists of America. And how they've seen an influx of people who are looking to join the party. Was that, now you mentioned that you went to an event last weekend. Was that their event, or was it a separate event that we're talking about?
It was a separate event, but I have infiltrated the Radical Revolutionary Communist Party too.
Okay.
I infiltrated their recruiting call for that. So it's interesting. Just to kind of back up a second here, there are probably thousands of far leftist collectivist groups around the country, and I'm not exaggerating when I say that. There are a lot of them, and so. Although they all have the common goal of overthrowing capitalism and instituting a Marxist society in the United States, there is differences of opinion on how to do it. There's differences in strategies. And basically what we have is a ton of little sleeper cells all over the United States that are attacking the problem from different perspectives. So the event that I attended this past weekend with the Transforming Gender Conference, those are going to be more like cultural Marxists or queer Marxists. They're trying to disrupt normativity around gender, around the nuclear family, the gender binary in the United States. The Revolutionary Communist Party, the new one that just launched a couple weeks ago to 2.3 million views on Twitter, those are Bolsheviks. And so they're a little bit different. They don't necessarily buy into all of the cultural Marxist stuff. Their goal is to overthrow capitalism in the United States, though, and they're growing rapidly. They're growing, I think they've doubled since August, and then they got a whole nother influx of new members when they launched this party. And what I want people to understand about that is what always happens in these scenarios is the cultural Marxists will get into that space and they will co-opt that organizing platform. And we can already see them starting to do it. There are already cultural Marxists that are involved in that group. And so I have no doubt that the people running that party actually have no idea what they're getting into with the cultural Marxism stuff. And so it's going to be kind of a fun development to watch. But broadly speaking, these ideas are very appealing to young people. And there are a lot of young people. I mean, I think they released a poll that says 20% of young people in America think that communism is the ideal system for America. You only need like 10 to 12% of people to overthrow a system. So they're on their way.
Yeah, and I pulled some stats just to sort of piggyback on that. Excuse me, can't remember if this was Gallup or not, but and this was as of 2019. But yeah, more than a third of millennials approved of communism. 55% of Americans had a negative view of it, but that means 42% had a positive view, and that number declined to 36% in 2022. But that's still more than a third of Americans. That's across multiple age brackets. So, I mean, what do you think is driving this flirtation with such radical ideas, as if we haven't had a history of knowing exactly where this leads in the long run?
The K through 12 public schools. There is no doubt of where this is coming from. It is the K through 12 public schools, because what's happened is that for the last 100 years, the Marxists from the Frankfurt School that came over, set up shop at Columbia University in New York right after World War II or before World War II, depending on who you ask, but right around that time period, they have been working on taking over the public education system in America ever since. First thing they did was they took over the colleges and universities. That gave them the teacher education colleges. So then they controlled how teachers in the United States are actually trained and what they have to learn in order to become teachers, right? Then teachers then go into every public school, every private school and charter school as well. This is not a problem that's exclusive to public schools, but that is where the biggest problem is. And they've been building up a little, like, basically the public schools are now an indoctrination factory for these leftist ideas. And when it started getting really bad is and this is something, again, that's harder for people to wrap their heads around. Listen, I'm a millennial. I had my former years in the 90s. When I was in public school, they didn't teach this stuff. But around 2008, 2009, 2010, what we found by doing research into just public school districts is that public schools all over the country started launching equity departments. These departments are in charge of teacher training, teacher development. They're in charge of infusing equity throughout the entire curriculum. And what that means is equity is a code word for Marxism. So for our purposes, what we're about to see in the United States is the first graduating high school and college classes of children who have been educated in equity in every part of their curriculum in K through 12 schools since they were 5 years old. This is going to be a big problem because people think, if you're not a liberal in your 20s, you have no heart. If you're not a conservative by your 30s, you have no brain. They're not going back this time. This is something they've been indoctrinated into since they were children. And we're about to unleash them into the workforce where they have a hatred of the economic system that's driving this country and will do everything they need to do to disrupt it.
So let's start here. Well, we've already started, but I want to have you tell me a little bit about the event that you went to last week. Because, again, this is sort of a continuation on what you've been talking about here, which is taking a cultural issue and using it as sort of a wedge to bring in these radical philosophies into the U.S. What happened at the event that you attended?
So this was the Transforming Gender Conference. It was held at the University of Colorado at Boulder. And they've been doing this conference for several years. I actually found out about it last year, but I think that they've done it for a couple years before that. And this is a queer Marxist conference. Every single session was about queer Marxism, infusing like the queer ideology, disrupting normativity, things like that. This was a rather large event. It was mostly younger people, but there were people of all ages there. And I would say there were probably at least 500 people at this event. There was a big lecture hall. I have a picture of it that I posted on my Substack of everyone going to the keynotes and stuff like that. Zoe Zephyr was there, who is the state rep out of Montana that got basically rejected by the Montana state legislature because she wasn't playing by the rules. So she's kind of like an icon in that community. She came to talk at the conference. They flew in people all over the country. I watched presentations about how they're working with queer and trans youth, specific state-funded organizations out in Colorado that are working to. I hesitate to say indoctrinate or groom kids, but that's kind of what they're doing, because what they do is they create these social systems that kids who are feeling awkward, who are feeling out of place, autistic people, especially, they really do target autistic kids more than anyone else, and they give them a community, and then they say, and you're not the gender in which you were born, and they teach them about being non-binary, and then they get social clout for being non-binary. So I watched presentations about that. I watched a presentation from a college professor who was talking about disrupting white spaces on college campuses. And I actually raised my hand during the presentation and I was like, can you tell me how whiteness interacts with capitalism? Just to kind of plant that question. And you should have heard the room. The whole room started laughing. They were like, oh my God, I'm so glad you asked about capitalism. And there was a whole rant about capitalism. It was great. But the most disturbing presentation I saw was from a PhD student that is literally studying this right now at the University of Colorado, where they were talking about multiple personality disorder as a gender identity. And this person has, well, dissociative disorder is a technical name, but most people know it by multiple personality disorder, which is why I use that. There were multiple people giving this presentation in one body, and they switched back and forth between the different beings throughout the presentation because they had different parts of the session. And what we learned is that there is a gender identity called system gender, because when you have more than one being in your head, that's called a system, and those different systems can be different genders. And so there's a system gender identity in which is the cumulative kind of like sum total of all the different genders that you have in your head, and they need to work out whether or not to transition, how to show up in the world, how to represent themselves. You don't actually have to be, oh gosh, it got so weird. They were talking about how you don't actually have to have a human identity. You can identify as a fictional character. You can identify as a non-human being. And actually, one of the people in the presentation that was giving it said that in their minds, how they show up in the world is they have a tail, but their physical body doesn't have a tail. And so it's weird for them to present in the physical body. But the most disturbing thing is there were multiple people in the room that you would look at and say they're trans, they're queer, they're showing up as this classic kind of SJW thing. They were all talking about having multiple personality disorder. So it wasn't just the presenter. There were multiple people in the room that had this, and they were told by this person that you shouldn't tell your therapist when you're going to get your letter for the transgender surgery that you have this disorder, because if you tell them, they're going to try to treat the disorder, and you're perfectly normal just as you are. And we need to disrupt what they call singlet normativity, which is this idea that we only have one being in our head because there's a spectrum apparently, and we're all on the spectrum, and we need to normalize having multiple personalities. And don't tell your gender therapist, because your gender therapist won't write the letter for surgery. I swear to God, I have the entire recording. It was nuts.
Yeah, this is crazy town. It's hard for me to even process this because it's just so wild that this has sort of become the norm. And I mean, I think back to when I was in college. I was pretty radical myself. I mean, at one point I had a declared minor in women's studies is how I like to tell people how far gone I was at the time. So again, just being a normal adult now, it's hard to sort of wrap my head around this. And let me ask you this. You mentioned that this is the first group of people to have been indoctrinated with this their entire lives. Now they're entering the workforce. They're going to be in positions of power. I mean, what does this mean for workplaces across the country and just for normal, regular, everyday people who just want to live their lives and be left alone?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the 4 goals of the woke left are always and forever the same. And I developed these after watching literally thousands of hours of their trainings where they just say the same thing over and over and over again. Their 4 goals are gain as much power as possible, destabilize the system, attack capitalism, usher in their Marxist utopia. Everything they do is around those 4 goals. And so what we're going to see in terms of these kids that have been indoctrinated into this ideology their entire life, and I would argue that they've been indoctrinated into a cult ideology, quite frankly, is that they're about to go into the workplace and we're about to see attacks on the corporate world and attacks on capitalism coming from all sides. So for example, the unions. Especially like the most pronounced one you can think of is Starbucks and the Starbucks union. That's all run by radical revolutionary socialists, and they're doing it specifically to disrupt the corporate system, which they view as inherently oppressive. You talked about inflation earlier. They love inflation. Why do they love inflation? Because when people can't afford groceries, they go to them and they say, "Do you know what's responsible for you not being able to afford groceries? Capitalism. Isn't capitalism horrible? Capitalism is making everything impossible. How about we try Marxism instead? How about we try a new system where the state will provide you with everything you need?" And what people need to hear is that this is their identity. This is what they believe, and this is not something they're not mentally ill, but they are indoctrinated into an ideology that has been there their entire lives. Their entire social systems are built around it, and they are literally willing to die for this ideology. And so what I think, and I don't actually think I'm being outlandish when I say this, I don't think that when the Civil War comes in this country, because I do think it will come at some point, it's not going to be red versus blue. It's not going to be Democrat versus Republican. It's going to be radical revolutionary socialist versus the federal government, because their ultimate goal is to overthrow the federal government. And I know that because I have them on video saying it. That Revolutionary Communist Party, I literally have them on video saying they want to overthrow the federal government, eliminate the Senate, eliminate the House of Representatives, eliminate the Supreme Court, and raise the red flag of communism above the White House. And I think they're on their way to doing it, and I don't actually think it's going to be that long before they try.
So maybe I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but how do we push back against this? Again, it's a large swath of America that's now bought into this crazy ideology. You mentioned that it's not just a phase. This is a core part of their own identity and who they see themselves as. So to attack these ideas to them means a personal attack against them. How do you put the toothpaste back in the tube? How do we unwind this and unpack this and convince these people that they're going down the wrong path?
I think that, well, that's a complicated question and a complicated answer, right? Because I don't think that our job right now should not be to try to convince them of anything. They're in a cult. You cannot convince someone to leave a cult when they do not want to leave the cult. What we need to do is change the way we're approaching this entire thing. And I think that one of the things I really struggle with, well, a couple of things, and you actually just said it earlier. You said, this is crazy. I can't even wrap my head around this. And I'm like, I agree with you. I'm literally in the room with these people when this is happening, and I can't wrap my head around this. But I think one of the challenges that we have is that most normal people have no idea this is going on. It's going on right under their noses. Their taxes are literally funding it. And it's very hard for them to look at information like the type of stories that I do and believe that this is real life. And I can show them video evidence. I can show them audio. I can show them photographs. And they're still like, this is nuts. And that's the correct answer. It is nuts, but it's also bigger than most people understand. And so I think the first step is that we need to start hinging ourselves back into reality and acknowledge this is a real phenomenon. And I know that when people do that, like the propensity is to kind of put up the blinders and say, I don't want to see it, like, and run away and pretend it's not real. But we have to start treating it as though it's real, and we have to start taking it seriously. What a lot of people do online with these issues is they view it as a great opportunity for like outrage porn, clickbait porn. They love owning the libs. They love posting all the cringe stuff that they do. And I acknowledge that the cringe stuff is funny and we can all take a moment to laugh at it. But you have to realize that when you're posting this stuff and all you're doing is tweeting about how crazy and mentally ill these people are, they're taking that as an opportunity to gain more ground, and they're winning. And so I think for my money, what I would love to see people do is to start to learn the language of the left, to start to view more about what they're doing in reality. And I hate to put it this bluntly, but what you guys see on Libs of TikTok is not real. Like, Libs of TikTok is outrage porn for the internet, and it drives a lot of clickbait, and I understand that. But that's not actually what's really happening, and that's not what's impacting most people's lives. What's impacting most people's lives is a lot more boring. And so I think that we need to teach people the language of the left. This is what I try to do in terms of showing people their presentations, breaking down what the language means. Because when normal people start to understand the language of the left, you start to see it show up everywhere. And that's when we can start inoculating ourselves to the ideas. That's when parents can start seeing it show up in their kids' school, in their kids' teachers' meetings. It's when we can start seeing it show up on the news, all this stuff. We need to inoculate ourselves to these ideas and be able to equip ourselves with the language to fight back against it. And until we do that, they're going to keep winning, and there's nothing we can do to stop it.
So what sort of language or buzzwords should people be on the lookout for?
I think the biggest one that people are confused about, and we already touched on it, is the idea of whiteness. Whiteness means capitalism. It does not mean white supremacy. I think another thing is just in general, people really need to understand that everything that they're doing is about abolishing capitalism. Every single thing. And I hear this all the time. People kind of dismiss what I'm doing and they say, oh, Carlin, we already know that socialists want to abolish capitalism. Like, duh. Okay, but do you know why? Do you know how the gender stuff leads into abolishing capitalism? Do you know how the nuclear family leads into abolishing capitalism? Do you know how whiteness, white supremacy leads back to that? Because this is the core of all these ideas. And so I think that people need to really start wrapping their head around the fact that Private property ownership is what they are targeting. Private property ownership means the following. It means your ability to own a home, your ability to own land, your ability to own a business, intellectual property. It means your ability to own a rental unit as a landlord. And most importantly, for what we're concerned about, it means your parental rights over your kids. They consider that to be a form of private property. And it also means your individual liberties. And I'm not making any of that up. Everything that I just said, I have them on tape saying this. I have it on video. And so when you think about it in that sense, every single attack that we're seeing leads back to this idea that they are going after every system that they believe upholds capitalism. Now that's boring, right? That's not as exciting as as a Gnostic sex cult or pedophilia or any of those things. But those ideas that are really outlandish, they're not hinged into reality of what the left is doing. And how I see it is like, what I see people doing is they're looking at a problem and they're thinking, this is the problem over here. So we basically have a situation where we have the magician's assistant, and the magician's assistant is wearing a sparkly dress and she's twirling around the stage, and you can see her boobs and her butt and all that, and everyone's paying attention to the magician's assistant over here, and this is Gnostic sex cult, and this is pedophiles, and this is grooming, and this is all this stuff over here, but the magician's over here. And this is where the trick is happening. And no one is paying attention to where the trick is actually happening because they're watching the sparkly, sexy assistant over here. We need to start looking over here, and we need to start being realistic because this is where all the progress is being made.
This whole thing seems to fit in real nice with Agenda 2030 and the World Economic Forum. Is there any involvement from those groups in sort of a larger scale? Is any entity, I guess, exerting any sort of centralized control over this movement? Or these groups just sort of balkanized and doing their own thing? What do you see?
That is a great question. And actually, I have them on tape talking about this directly. So I understand why people think this is related to Agenda 2030 and the WEF and Klaus Schwab and all that. But what people need to understand is those are two different groups. They're two different groups that have the same general goal. The Radical Revolutionary Socialists and the WEF both want a globalist society. They both want control over that society. They have a lot of similar ideas. But the Radical Revolutionary Socialists in the United States hate the WEF. They hate them. They've talked about this openly. I get communists that come on my channel every once in a while, and they like hang out in the chat and we ask them questions and things. And one of them a couple weeks ago was actually making fun of us. He's like, you guys are stupid if you think we like the WEF. And I've heard them say this at their private events in person. They hate them. And so basically what we have is the WEF over here. We've got the Radical Revolutionary Socialists over here. They're like two Major League Baseball teams that both want to win the World Series, which means they're going to fight at some point. And we're all going to be stuck in the middle of it and going, okay, none of these options are actually good for us. So there is overlap in that respect in terms of they want the same thing, but they don't work together at all.
So, and to ask you this again, and I'm sorry if I sort of keep hammering you all this, but as far as what steps to take to roll this back, I mean, once people, let's just say, learn the language and learn how people communicate and start to see these things happening in their communities and their churches or their places of employment, what action steps can we take other than running away to try to sort of remedy this issue? Again, if it's a group of people who has just grown up with this their entire life and know nothing else.
Yeah, so I understand why you're hammering on it, and I appreciate that. What I will tell people is I wrote a whole book with like 4 chapters worth of checklists called Actively Unwoke, the ultimate guide for fighting back against the woke insanity in your life. And so if people want highly, highly practical steps, I would recommend that book. But here's the reason I'm not going to give you what those steps are right now. And it's not just because I want to sell more books. No one makes money off of books, okay? It's just like that's the resource if you want it. But people really underestimate what's required to learn the language. I have for the last 2 years been teaching people the language 6 days a week on my YouTube channel, on my Rumble channel, for free, completely in public. And what I've learned is it takes people 6 months to a year to really start to internalize this language. And so it's not actually a small thing. We are very literally learning to speak a foreign language. This is like learning to speak French or Russian or anything else. And I think people really underestimate the complexity of it. They underestimate how hard it is. Now, I've gotten pretty good at breaking it down very simply, and I have a system in place that allows people to learn a lot quicker, but a lot of people want to skip over this step. They don't want to put the work in. They think it's boring. They don't want to watch this stuff. Believe me, I understand. I watch it every day. It sucks. It's not the best way to spend some time. But if you don't do that step, no tactic that you implement is going to work, because again, it's like, if you go in and you buy my book and you get my checklist and all that stuff, and this is the mistake I made when I wrote the book, and you try to implement those tactics but you don't understand the language, we're going to come up to that problem again where you're at the magician's assistant. You're going at the magician's assistant, where the magician is where we need to be going. And so I know people want answers. I know people want tactics. I'm not willing to give them, other than to say, sit your butt down and I will teach you the language. And once you learn the language, you will understand why I forced you into that step in the first place.
So, and this is a similar question. I'm sorry again, but I have to ask you. I mean, what steps can parents take to shield their kids from this if it's being given to them at school and after school activities and times when parents aren't around? And again, you have schools that we've seen where teachers are transitioning kids with explicit instructions not to have parental involvement. So what steps can parents take to try to prevent their kids from being indoctrinated into this in the first place?
I love this question, and it is probably the only question you could ask me that I would give a direct answer to. Get your kids out of public schools. Get your kids out of public schools today. And I know that people don't want to homeschool and they find it intimidating. But the fact of the matter is that I can go onto any school website in the country, even in Florida, even in red areas, even in Texas, and I can show you exactly how they are indoctrinating your kids within 15 minutes. It's really not that hard. They are usurping these laws that have been passed all the time. Like, I live in New Hampshire, where we have an anti-CRT law. We passed one of the first ones in the country. I can literally go onto school websites and find out how they're teaching CRT and send that information to the state. State does nothing about it. And so do not assume that if you're in one of these red states that has these laws, that your kids are safe. Like I said at the beginning, when I was talking about going undercover at the Socialism conference, I ran into a guy named Jesse Hagopian. Jesse Hagopian is a high school teacher out of Seattle. I think he works at Garfield High School in Seattle. He works with the Zinn Education Project. He works with an organization called Rethinking Schools. He is on the board of Black Lives Matter in Education. And I have Jesse Hagopian on tape talking about working with teachers in Florida, where what they do to get around Ron DeSantis's anti-woke laws is they will zoom in teachers from out of state into their classroom. So the out-of-state teachers teach the banned concepts to the students, and the teachers in state now have plausible deniability to say, we didn't know, we didn't do it, he was out of state. They call this fugitive pedagogy or smuggler pedagogy. The public schools are not fixable. You need to get your kids out. That is the only way to protect them, and just go from there.
Well, this is a lot to process. You've given a lot of great information, and you're doing some fantastic work out there. Real quick, for anybody who wants to reach out to you, where's the best place to reach you?
Hey, I really appreciate you having me, and I know this is a lot of information, but the first place people can find me is on my Substack. That is Carlin, KARLYN.substack.com. That's where you're going to find my best written content. That's where you're going to find breakdowns of the language and video clips, stuff like that. I also do stream Monday through Friday at 5 p.m. and on Saturdays at 6 p.m. on YouTube, on Rumble, on X, where I will show you the videos. You can come and join a community where we will teach you the language. And, you know, I know this sounds boring and scary, and it is all of those things, but I do actually try to make it fun for people to learn this stuff. We have a good time. We drink beer. We hang out. We joke. We laugh. We laugh at them, too, because they're kind of funny sometimes. But those are the best places to find me, is on my Substack and on my Rumble and YouTube and X.
Awesome. Well, thanks for joining me today. I appreciate your time.
Hey, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.